Hey everybody, in today's episode I'm going to be continuing in my series on depth psychology and the teachings of Carl Jung and Stanislav Grof by focusing on the second chapter of my new zine called Psychology, the Science of the Soul, an introduction to the spiritual worldview of depth psychology. In the first 3 episodes of this series, I focused on the teachings of Carl Jung and his model of the human psyche. On the first of those 3, I did an overview of the first chapter of this publication, which is all based around Carl Jung's work. And then in the 2 episodes that followed, I sampled and commented on a number of clips from Carl Jung himself, as well as from Joseph Campbell and Manly Hall, which all overview and outline in further detail Carl Jung's basic framework of the human psyche. In this episode, I'm going to be now moving on to the second chapter of the zine, which focuses on the work of Stanislav Grof. Stanislav Grof is a giant in the field of psychology, but he's not well known to the majority of people in the way that Carl Jung is. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who this man was and why he's significant. Stanislav Grof was active in the field from the 1950s up through essentially today. I think he's probably retired at this point. I think he's in his 90s now, 80s or 90s. But he was active for a long period of time. And some of his very important work goes up to the 2010, 2015 period. So it's amazing the longevity of this man. But he came up as a Freudian trained psychoanalyst. But early on in his career, things took a turn more towards the direction of Jungian psychology. And that happened through his volunteering to be part of a trial for early research into LSD. And he volunteered to be a participant in a LSD-themed trial. This was a lab sort of clinical trial, controlled and observed by research psychologists. So during this trial, this clinical trial, he had a large LSD dose and had a profound experience of consciousness in which he encountered elements of the unconscious, archetypal elements of the unconscious in Jungian terms. But he had a very profound experience of consciousness, and it changed the course of his career and his research work. And from then on, he would focus on using LSD and other drugs in a clinical setting to research non-ordinary states of consciousness and to examine what those states implied about what the structure of the human psyche is. And what he ended up concluding was that Carl Jung's model of the psyche was essentially correct, in that there is an unconscious realm of the psyche populated by these numinous archetypal principles that we're not normally aware of, but during certain mystical states you can encounter them to profound effect. And so he studied that over the course of his career, and so his method was to induce these mystical states of consciousness in patients, and he would also participate in certain trials, so he has a lot of experience himself with this. And his own experiences are very interesting and are the subject of some of his best writing. But when you put it together with his experiences and thousands of patients' experiences, it's a large data set to draw on about what's encountered during these non-ordinary states of consciousness. And when you analyze that data set, it can inform you about what is true of the human psyche that we're not normally aware of during our waking state of consciousness. And again, what he was able to confirm was that there is an unconscious realm that is populated by these archetypal powers and forces, and that these can be encountered to great effect during non-ordinary states of consciousness. It's important to note that in the first half of his career, he was using different drug-based methods, again, always in a clinical setting. But in the second half of his career, he worked to develop non-drug-based approaches, and his approaches called holotropic breath work that he developed. It's based on different shamanistic and tribal methods of inducing these mystical states, these sort of trance states that can trigger the psyche to turn inward and to encounter these realms of the unconscious. And so it's not all about drugs, but the overall point is to map and study the human psyche at a level that we don't normally have access to in our waking state of consciousness. So I want to read a quote from Richard Tarnas, who is somebody who I've been quoting a lot in these videos. He's featured a lot in this work, and he's a colleague of Stanislav Grof's. So summarizing Stan Groff's career, Tarnas writes, Groff began as a psychoanalytic psychiatrist, and the original background of his ideas was Freudian and not Jungian. Yet the unexpected upshot of his work was to ratify Jung's archetypal perspective on a new level. The basis of Groff's discoveries was his observation of several thousand psychoanalytic sessions, first in Prague and then in Maryland with the National Institute of Mental Health, in which subjects used extremely potent psychoactive substances, particularly LSD, and then later a variety of powerful non-drug therapeutic methods, which served as catalysts of unconscious processes. Groff found that subjects involved in these sessions tended to undergo progressively deeper explorations of the unconscious, in the course of which there consistently emerged sequences of encounters with archetypal principles. I'm sort of paraphrasing in that last section. But overall, looking at the significance of Groff's work, Tarnas writes, the most epistemologically significant development in the recent history of depth psychology, and indeed the most important advance in the field as a whole, since Freud and Jung, has been the work of Stanislav Grof. So again, this is a major player in the field of psychology. So these mystical states of consciousness, these non-ordinary states in which elements of the unconscious are confronted and encountered by the psyche, Stanislav Grof gives the particular term holotropic experience. So a holotropic experience is essentially a mystical, spiritual type of experience. And I want to give a series of quotes here from Groff's book, The Cosmic Game, which is one of my favorites of his, probably my favorite. And in that book, he overviews the basic worldview that he's uncovered during his research, and he compares it with the paradigms of esoteric philosophy, mystical philosophies, and the traditional mythologies of ancient religion, and shows how they favorably compare with each other. In other words, he's using the techniques of modern psychology to affirm basically Jung's view that mythologies are rooted in the archetypes of the unconscious and the ability of the human being to encounter these unconscious realms during certain non-ordinary or extraordinary states of consciousness that come about during rare moments in life. So Groff writes, my primary interest is to focus on experiences that represent a useful source of data about the human psyche and the nature of reality, particularly those that reveal various aspects of the spiritual dimension of existence. Contemporary psychiatry does not have a specific term for these experiential states. Because I am convinced that they deserve to be distinguished from the rest and placed into a special category, I have coined for them the name holotropic. Holotropic states are characterized by a specific transformation of consciousness associated with perceptual changes in all sensory areas, intense and often unusual emotions, and profound alterations in the thought processes. They are also usually accompanied by a variety of intense psychosomatic manifestations and unconventional forms of behavior. Consciousness is changed qualitatively in a very profound and fundamental way. In holotropic states, we experience the intrusion of other dimensions of existence that can be very intense and even overwhelming. During such states, the intellect is not impaired, but it operates in a way that is significantly different from its everyday functioning. We can be flooded with remarkable new information on a variety of subjects. We can reach profound psychological insights concerning our personal history, unconscious dynamics, emotional difficulties, and interpersonal problems. We can also experience extraordinary revelations concerning various aspects of nature and the cosmos that transcend our educational and intellectual background. So that's the focus of his research, is to understand how to induce these states and to study that and develop methodologies for how to induce these states and to understand at what moments in life are these spiritual states of consciousness developed and encountered, and what role did they play in ancient society and what role should they play in modern society. He studied that on one hand, but then he also studied the contents of what is encountered. And across thousands of different clinical lab-controlled studies of these states of consciousness, in which detailed notes of what patients report to have experienced during these states, he cross-compares them and cross-analyzes them, and based on that is able to develop a model of what is encountered during these states. And basically his model affirms Carl Jung's model of the unconscious and the archetypes that reside therein. So then continuing, quoting Stan Grof here, he writes, "The content of holotropic states of consciousness are often philosophical and mystical. In these episodes, we can experience sequences of psycho-spiritual death and rebirth, or feelings of oneness with other people, nature, the universe, and God. We might uncover what seem to be memories from other incarnations, encounter powerful archetypal beings, communicate with discarnate entities, and visit numerous mythological domains. The rich spectrum of these states also includes out-of-body experiences. To better illustrate the nature of these experiences, here's a description from one of Groff's patients." So this is a case study of what a holotropic experience is like, what a mystical state of consciousness is like for one who experiences it. "I seem to have connected in a very profound way with life on Earth. At first, I went through a whole series of identifications with individual animals from various species, but later the experience became more and more encompassing. My identity spread horizontally in space to include all living forms, but also vertically in time. I became the Darwinian evolutionary tree in all its ramifications. However incredible this might sound, I experienced myself as the totality of life." Now remember, it's important that we consider what Jung said, and this is something that was emphasized and quoted in my series of videos in which I cite Carl Jung's clips from Carl Jung directly, when he talks about the basis of his approach to psychology is to treat the human psyche as something that's real. It's not an epiphenomena of the brain. It's not an arbitrary field. The things that we experience are not arbitrary encounters. They're part of reality. And therefore, we must never trivialize or dismiss what the human psyche experiences. We must always try to understand them. And that approach is what gave Jung the capacity to develop the theories that he did and to make such breakthrough ideas, is that he alone was the first to really take seriously human psychological experiences, no matter if they're coming from somebody who's a schizophrenic or not. There's something about the schizophrenic's engagement with life the fact of what he's encountering in his mind is real. So Jung was saying that the human psyche is like an energy system, just like the energy systems that we know in this world of objective physical form. But the energy system of the psyche just exists on a different level of matter. It exists in a more subtle dimension, so it's not tangibly seen or felt, but yet it still operates with similar dynamics to the energy systems that we do see in our world. And so when things go wrong psychologically with mental illness and such, his approach was that the energy flow dynamics of that system are being impaired, and that impairment results or manifests as disease and disorder, mental disease and disorder. So taking that approach, we should understand that using psychoactive drugs doesn't mean that you move into a world of illusion. It's just that you move into a world in which the energy flow dynamics of your psyche are being altered. And so based on that altering of these flow dynamics and how it interfaces with the physical body, that your subjective conscious awareness, the qualities of what you're conscious of changes, and so you enter an alternate space of consciousness. So in a way, Groff has a similar thing with Jung in that Groff took these psychedelic drugs. He looked at their effects as being real. And so he took them seriously. And that's why he was one of the first people and became a pioneer in wanting to actually understand and study what patients say when they go into these altered states of consciousness. He didn't just dismiss them as these people just on drugs. He was like, I want to know what is experienced with people on drugs. And like myself, I've taken many psychedelic drugs over the course of my life, and the things that you experience during these different states are very much real in the sense that they have an objective effect on you. Just as if you encountered something in this world of physical form that was impactful to you and changed you, you can also experience something in a LSD session or a mushroom session or DMT or whatever, and that you can go through a conscious experience that's internal that can also change you. So inner world or outer world, you can be changed. So there's a type of reality to the inner world. The dynamics are different from the outer world, but nonetheless, there's a reality to those inner dynamics in the inner world of the psyche. And in Groff and Jung, and I guess the characteristic of depth psychology as a whole is to take seriously this inner world and to not be dismissive of it in the way that in this popular mindset, people tend to dismiss their own subjective experience of life in certain situations and to trivialize dreams or psychedelic experiences or things like that, and to discount what they experience if it goes in contrast to the normal waking state of rational consciousness that is very much emphasized in our society. And I just wanted to note that this is a theme in depth psychology that we need to incorporate into our modern society and modern life, is to value the inner subjective life of human beings. I mean, I'll also say that, not to go into too much detail, but I can say in certain dreams I've had, and in particularly one of the psychedelic experiences I had myself an encounter with an archetypal symbol or archetypal force within the unconscious. And so I can state from personal experience that these things can be encountered, and when they are very impactful and they stay with you. And when you experience them, the meaning of it is not given to you. They're still presented to you as a mystery to be solved, but it's an aspect of reality that you're being exposed to that undoubtedly influences the way you look at the idea that the only thing that's real is the physical world of material reality, that you can begin to unravel that idea that the only thing that is true is this rational world of form, that there's an inner world of subjective life that is very real, and in fact perhaps more real than the outer world. Continuing now to quote Groff, and these are all notes that are in the zine here, I want to talk a little bit about the historical background of mysticism and the role that it plays. And again, this is coming from The Cosmic Game. Groff writes, throughout the centuries, these experiences, meaning holotropic experiences, and the realms of existence they disclose have been described in the context of spiritual philosophies and mystical traditions, such as Vedanta, Mahayana Buddhism, Taoism, Sufism, Gnosticism, Christian mysticism, the Kabbalah, etc. The findings of my research and contemporary consciousness research, in general, essentially confirm and support the position of these ancient teachings. This research shows that, in its farthest reaches, the psyche of each of us is essentially commensurate with all of existence and ultimately identical with the cosmic creative principle itself. This conclusion is in far-reaching agreement with the image of reality found in the great spiritual and mystical traditions of the world. Many of the great spiritual systems are products of centuries of in-depth exploration of the human psyche and consciousness that in many ways resembles scientific research. These systems offer detailed instructions concerning the methods of inducing spiritual experiences on which they base their philosophical speculations. They have systematically collected data drawn from these experiences and subjected them to collective consensus validation, usually over a period of many centuries. These are exactly the stages necessary for achieving valid and reliable knowledge in any area of scientific endeavor. And this is an important point that I emphasize a lot, is that the concept of science that we're familiar with is not the actual story of science. Like, we're told that science is something that was invented by Europeans in the 1700s, but I immediately ask, okay, well, the great Gothic cathedrals in Europe were built in the 10th century, 11th, 12th centuries. So how could those things have been built without science? How could the great monuments of antiquity have been built without science? How could the techniques and practices of yoga and the systems of Chinese medicine and Tai Chi and things like that, how could those disciplines and practice have been developed without techniques that resemble science? So, as he's pointing out here, the methods of ancient philosophy were developed in accordance with a method that we would consider scientific. And my basic point is that these systems of knowledge are grounded or were developed by the philosophical groups of antiquity. And the philosophical groups were integrating religion and science and have always been doing that. That philosophy, science, and religion are a triangulation that are never actually separated. When we separate them, we fall into error and ignorance. But to truly reorient ourselves into a coherent view, we have to, again, complete this triangle in which philosophy, religion, and science are understood as three integrated aspects of the human being, of human life, that cannot be separated. Science being the engagement with the outer world, religion being the engagement with the inner world, and philosophy being the home to the methods and techniques by which one and the other interact. It synthesizes the two. So philosophy is about the discipline of releasing the inner religious life, the inner experience, by gaining mastery over the outer life, the body and the body's orientation with the world. So science is about the outer world, religion is about the inner world, and philosophy is about the perfection of the two. So now I have a section from Manly P. Hall, and it's a compilation of quotes from him in which he discusses the mystical experience and gives it a context about the importance of the spirituality and the engagement of consciousness with the inner spiritual life, the role that it plays in human life and in human society. So he writes, quote, "The mystical experience may be described as the inward experience of universals, a meditative or contemplative participation in a divine or infinite plan or pattern of consciousness. It is a sense of luminance of the presence of light, the deep inner feeling of the presence of God, or of the divine power, life, or substance in which man exists. It is proximity to eternity. The mystical experience is a strange experiencing of the infinite, which transcends all ordinary psychological phenomena. As described by Lao Tzu, it is a tremendous, overwhelming at-one-ment with eternal life. The concept of illumination rests upon one point, namely, that the life principle in man does not originate in the body, nor is it a byproduct of body principles or activities. Man is, in some way, keyed to universal dynamics. He is alive because there is a life within him moving through a highly specialized organism, resulting in the functions which we recognize. Because man has within himself a core life, a center from which radiates continuously the power that makes him a living being, it is conceivable that he can be capable of estimating, understanding, and directly experiencing this life source within him. The genuine mystical experience may come only once in a lifetime. It does not require any restatement of itself, nor any desperate effort to bring back a parallel or similar experience. The one experience, the impact itself, lasts for an entire lifetime, and the person who has it can never be what he was before. he suddenly has a totally new, valid relationship with existence. In the next section, I go into the relationship between holotropic states of experiences, which is, again, is Groff's term for mystical encounters with the unconscious, with the relationship between these experiences and the existence of archetypes, and the relationship also between archetypes and myths, the different religious myths of world history. Groff writes, quote, "In holotropic states, we discover that our psyche has access to entire pantheons of mythological figures, as well as to domains that they inhabit. According to Jung, these are manifestations of a primordial universal pattern that represents intrinsic constituents of the collective unconscious. Encounters with these archetypal figures, when reported by patients or even when experienced by Groff in his own experiences, or I can say it in my own experience, they're very impressive and often brought new and detailed information that was independent of the subject's racial, cultural, and educational background and previous intellectual knowledge of their respective mythologies. Depending on the nature of the deities involved, these experiences were accompanied by extremely intense emotions, ones ranging from ecstatic rapture to paralyzing metaphysical terror. People who experienced these encounters usually viewed these archetypal beings with great awe and respect, seeing them as beings that belonged to a superior order, who were endowed with extraordinary energies and power, who had the capacity to shape events in our material world. These subjects thus shared the attitude of many pre-industrial cultures that have believed in the existence of deities and of demons." Now, I give a few examples in this book of case studies of patients' encounters with archetypal principles in the psyche. But my favorite one comes from actually Stan Grof himself. And he offers this in his book, The Cosmic Game. And it really gets to the heart of what archetypes are all about, and also how holotropic experiences engage with archetypes or reveal archetypes. So in this little subsection, it was just called All the World's a Stage. I kind of give the lead intro to it by saying, in The Cosmic Game, Groff offers a colorful description of an archetypal encounter of his own, one that is very illustrative in that it gets right to the heart of what archetypes are all about. Quote, "In the final sequence of the session, I had a vision of a large, brilliantly lit stage that was located somewhere beyond space and time. It had a beautiful, ornate curtain decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to contain the entire history of the world. I intuitively understood that I was visiting the theater of the cosmic drama, featuring the forces that shape human history. I began to witness a magnificent parade of mysterious figures who entered the stage, presented themselves, and slowly departed. I realized that what I was seeing were personified universal principles, archetypes, which, through a complex interplay, create the illusion of the phenomenal world. They were protean personages, condensing many identities, many functions, and even many scenes. As I was watching them, they kept changing their forms in an extremely intricate holographic interpenetration, being one and many at the same time. I was aware that they had many different facets, levels, and dimensions of meaning, but was not able to focus on anything in particular. Each of these figures seemed to represent simultaneously the essence of his or her function, as well as all the concrete manifestations of the principle they represented. There was Maya, the magical ethereal figure symbolizing the world illusion; Anima, embodying the eternal female; the warrior, a Mars-like personification of war and aggression; the lovers, representing all the sexual dramas and romances throughout the ages; the royal figure of the ruler or emperor; the withdrawn hermit; the facetious and elusive trickster, and many others. As they were passing across the stage, they bowed in my direction, as if expecting appreciation for their stellar performance in the divine play of the universe." And then I have another case study here. This one actually comes from Carl Jung, and in the video where I did an overview of the first chapter of this zine on Carl Jung, I at the very end of it gave a quote that talked about Carl Jung's dream, his yogi dream, in which he encountered a yogi in a cathedral who had his face, and essentially that yogi represented an archetypal figure representing the self, the higher self, and that's an archetypal experience. And another one of his dreams, Jung had a recurring encounter with an archetypal figure which he called Philemon. And in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung writes the following about this archetypal figure, Philemon. He writes, Philemon was a pagan and brought with him an Egypto-Hellenistic atmosphere with a Gnostic coloration. He and other figures of my fantasies brought home to me the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Philemon represented a force which was not myself. In my fantasies, I held conversations with him, and he said things which I had not consciously thought. For I observed clearly that it was he who spoke, not I. He said I treated thoughts as if I generated them myself, but in his view, thoughts were like animals in the forest, or people in a room, or birds in the air. And he added, if you should see people in a room, you would not think that you had made those people, or that you were responsible for them. Through him, the distinction was clarified between myself and the object of my thought. He confronted me in an objective manner, and I understood that there is something in me which can say things that I do not know and I do not intend, things which may even be directed against me. Psychologically, Philemon represented superior insight. He was a mysterious figure to me. At times he seemed to me quite real, as if he were a living personality. I went walking up and down the garden with him, and to me he was what the Indians call a guru. The fact was that he conveyed to me many an illuminating idea. Now, in our discussion of the unconscious and the archetypes residing within the unconscious, we discussed the idea that the apex of the archetypes, these archetypal figures and motifs within the unconscious, and these elements of mythology, the apex of this inner mythology that we all have in our unconscious is the self. And the self equates to God, the God concept. And so I have a special section here about what it's like to encounter divinity, to encounter the self, or to encounter God. And to set the stage, I have a couple quotes from Jung that talk about the psychological reality of the self, and thus the fact that God is a psychological reality, no matter how you choose to define it in the outer world. The truth is that you can encounter something in the inner world that when you encounter it, you know that it is God. And all the outer descriptions in terms of the descriptions in the books of the world's religion, none of them are adequate to an inner experience of this divine principle. So, simply put, Carl Jung writes, God is a psychological fact that happens to people. And another quote, he writes, I must point out that there is no question of belief, but of experience. Religious experience is absolute. It is indisputable. You can only say you have never had such an experience, and your opponent will say, sorry, I have. And there your discussion will come to an end. No matter what the world thinks about religious experience, the one who has it possesses a great treasure of a thing that has provided him with a source of life, meaning, and beauty. And this is what I mean by depth psychology being this special branch of science that can allow religion and science to come back into communication with each other. Because he's saying that religion is a fact of the human psyche. God is a fact of the human psyche. That these things can be experienced within. Not a God out there, but a God within. And that's the domain of psychology. So this encounter with the archetype of the self, i.e. God, is something that Stanislav Grof spends a lot of time on, and that he himself and that different patients of his encountered in various clinical trials that they had. Not everybody would encounter it, but certain patients did have these certain transformative experiences with something that was very, very transcendent. And so I want to give some quotes that are from both his book, The Cosmic Game, but also from his other book, Psychology of the Future, on this topic of the archetype of God within the psyche. Groff writes, quote, "The supreme principle can be directly experienced in holotropic states of consciousness, but it eludes any attempts at adequate description or explanation. The language that we use to communicate about matters of daily life simply is not adequate for this task. Individuals who have had this experience seem to agree that it is ineffable. Words and the structure of our language are painfully inappropriate tools to describe its nature and dimensions, particularly to those who have not had it." He elaborates on this point, noting that those who report an experience of the supreme principle state that this encounter involved transcendence of all limitations of the analytical mind, all rational categories, and all the constraints of ordinary logic. The experience was not bound by the usual limitations of three-dimensional space and linear time as we know them from everyday life. Rather, it contained all conceivable polarities in an inseparable amalgam, and thus transcended dualities of any kind. One of the ways I think about this is that in our normal state of consciousness is one in which consciousness is oriented in the individual, the bodily self, the lower self. And this state of consciousness is characterized by a duality of self, not self. And in the experience of the divine, which I can't claim to have had myself, but in my studies of Manly P. Hall and in my studies of depth psychology and other authors of esoteric philosophy and mystical philosophies, it seems that the encounter with the divine is one in which the consciousness principle within yourself gradually elevates and moves outside of this polarity and becomes detached from its localization in the body and this self, not self dynamic. And then as it sort of elevates and lifts and moves out almost into space, from place into space, it transcends this state of duality and then becomes consciousness in a unified state in which the consciousness principle envelops all things and you become identified with all things. And in a way you can think of, if you go back to some of the material I've done in previous episodes, the idea that creation is the consequence of the unity of consciousness, which is the creator, this unified consciousness, entering into a meditation in which its unified consciousness moves, and during this meditation, it moves inward and into this self-created situation in which it manifests this world of material form. And this unified consciousness, the consciousness splits up almost into a number of seeds, and these seeds become planted in the various archetypal forms that are to populate this world of material form. And then gradually, through the evolution of this world, the seed within these forms grows and evolves. And the culmination of this experience is eventually the consciousness principle within these seeds begins to intermingle and to re-identify both with each other and then eventually with the totality itself. And so when this happens, when the consciousness again emerges out of this creation activity to re-identify with the totality of itself, then the meditation is complete and the creation for that cycle is dissolved and the life principle again becomes unified. So in an encounter with deity, an encounter with the divine archetype is almost a situation in which this consciousess seed principle within yourself is momentarily lifted back up out of this world of creation, and it enters back into its home, its true source, which is this unified state of divine consciousness. And so that's what's happening, is that basically God awakens to its own dream, and we're all creations of this dream, this meditation. And so during this spiritual experience, this divine experience, the consciousness seed is woken up, and you, for at least for a moment, identify with the idea that you are this unified consciousness. You are the creator behind all creation, and that we're all manifestations of this creator. And so we all have the capacity to have this experience, and actually we're all destined to have this experience and to evolve to a state where the creator awakens within us. So I want to continue on with some quotes from Stan Grof on this topic. He writes, despite the overwhelming nature of this event, people who have had the experience of the supreme principle know that they have encountered God. Time after time, people compared the absolute to a radiant source of light of unimaginable intensity. They also describe it as an immense and unfathomable field of consciousness, endowed with an infinite intelligence and creative power. Groff then continues, when we reach experiential identification with the absolute, we realize that our own being is ultimately commensurate with the entire cosmic network of existence. This recognition of our own divine nature, our identity with the cosmic source, is the most important discovery we can make during the process of deep exploration. He continues, transpersonal experiences suggest that human consciousness is continuous with the inner nature of the universe, which, from this perspective, appears to be a unified web of events in consciousness. This realization confronts the individual with the profound truth that our everyday identification with the skin-encapsulated ego, i.e. embodied individual consciousness, is an illusion, and that our true nature is that of cosmic creative energy, Atman Brahman. Which is kind of what I was saying about the idea of creation being a cosmic meditation, and that we are all actually creations of this great meditational process, which is contained within unified consciousness itself. So in that light, that the universe is a unified web of events happening in consciousness, and that we are part of this web of events. So again, there's one self, many selves, and the many selves are all creations and products of this one self. And the ultimate destiny of things is for this one self to awaken within the many selves as the true sovereign power in its own creation. And the destiny of these selves is the awakened selves is to fulfill the purpose of this meditation, to create, to follow the purpose of the divine will behind this creation, and to ultimately thereby dissolve the necessity for the continuance of this meditation, to fulfill the meditation so that the cycle can be complete, creation can be absolved, and the unity of consciousness can then be restored in its absolute state. And then a period of rest will ensue, and then a higher cycle of creation will then commence in some future era or some future age. And the last page of this chapter on Stan Grof and Holotropic Experience, I have a couple more quotes that have to do with encounters with deity. And I want to point out that Groff notes that deity can be encountered both as in its yin essence or its yang essence, meaning its fullness or emptiness. So the emptiness he terms the void, and it's possible to have an archetypal encounter with what he calls the void, which I think of as the cosmic mother. And then you could also have an experience of the fullness, which is the numinous, the light aspect of deity, which you might think of as God the Father. So regarding the luminous aspect of deity, I have a quote here. This is from the Cosmic Game. Groff shares a case study from a patient. The patient writes, "The beginning of the experience was very sudden and dramatic. I was hit by a cosmic thunderbolt of immense power that instantly shattered and dissolved my everyday reality. I completely lost contact with the surrounding world. It disappeared as if by magic. At that time, My only reality was a mass of swirling proportions that seemed to contain all of existence in an entirely abstract form. It had the brightness of myriad suns, yet it was not on the continuum with any light I know from everyday life. It seemed to be pure consciousness, intelligence, and creative energy transcending all polarities. It was infinite and finite, divine and demonic, terrifying and ecstatic, creative and destructive, all of that and much more. I had no concept, no categories for what I was witnessing. I could not maintain a sense of separate existence in the face of such a force. My ordinary identity was shattered and dissolved. I became one with the source. In contrast, we have the cosmic void or the cosmic mother. So here is another case study. So here Groff describes this, what it's like to encounter this cosmic void. He writes, "When we encounter the void, we feel that it is a primordial emptiness of cosmic proportions and relevance. We become pure consciousness, aware of this absolute nothingness. However, at the same time, we have a strange paradoxical sense of its essential fullness. This cosmic vacuum is also a plenum, since nothing seems to be missing in it. While it does not contain anything in a concrete, manifest form, it seems to comprise all existence in a potential state. This metaphysical vacuum, pregnant with potential for everything there is, appears to be the cradle of all being, the ultimate source of existence. The creation of all phenomenal worlds is then the realization and concretization of its pre-existing potentialities. The void is unchangeable and lies behind all dichotomies and polarities, such as light and darkness, good and evil, stability and motion, microcosm and macrocosm, agony and ecstasy, singularity and plurality, form and emptiness, and even existence and non-existence. The metaphysical vacuum, pregnant with potential for everything there is, appears to be the cradle of all being, the ultimate source of existence. The creation of all phenomenal worlds is then the realization and concretization of its pre-existing potentialities." So how do we make sense of the void versus the fullness? It's essentially spirit versus matter. And the idea is that, and the true reality is one in which there is no differentiation. It's unified being. But in the process of entering this meditation and becoming creation, the active principle, the positive principle, becomes separated through a deliberate act from the negative or the maternal principle. So the father and mother separate into spirit matter. And then the separation of these two, the polarization, creates the condition in which the third state can be created, which is the child. The child is born from this polarity between father and mother, and so that's the son, that's the child. And within this child the child represents the soul, the world's soul, but it's within this that the whole creation happens and takes place. So it's born, goes through an archetypal life pattern, matures, and then comes to completion. And when the child becomes complete or becomes as the father, then the creation is absolved and becomes complete. And the three, this trinity, archetypal trinity, the three become one again, become this unified state, and that's the completion of the creative act. And then just quickly, I want to give a quote that comes from one of Groff's patients about an encounter with the void. He writes, "Suddenly, an enormous void opened up inside this world. Visually, it took the form of a warping of my visual field. Everything was being stretched and stopped to reveal this underlying reality. It was as if God suddenly paused between inhaling and exhaling, and the entire universe was suddenly suspended, not dissolved, but held in its place for an eternity. It was a gaping, yawning opening in existence. As I soaked in this experience, I realized that this was the void out of which all form springs. This was the living stillness out of which all movement flows." So this concludes the second chapter of the zine, and we can see how this discussion with Groff's work integrates in very important ways with Jung's model of the psyche, and how the two really go together in a central way. And when you put them together, you begin to have this really breakthrough understanding of how the science of psychology opens the door for us to now reinterpret mythology and religion in an entirely new way. And these are the components that we can leverage and use to redefine our relationship with religion in this modern context, in this so-called secular scientific age in which the universe has become disenchanted, and we've disensouled the universe, how we can reinsole it with meaning and purpose through this vehicle of psychology, and we can bring back religion into our lives in an important way. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, this copy of the publication, Psychology, the Science of the Soul, it's available at my e-store, thewisdomtradition.bigcartel.com. There's also a link on my website, www.alexsacken.com. Please check it out. Get a copy if you don't have one yet. And thank you very much for tuning in. God bless.